Unlivable planet, unstoppable girl. Crops thrived and monsters became her pets. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Part 1. The Last Garden. The crimson dust settled over the skeletal remains of what had once been New Eden's agricultural district. Maya Chen pressed her palm against the cracked earth, feeling the familiar pulse of corruption that had claimed 97% of the planet's arable land. The Geiger counter on her wrist clicked steadily, marking radiation levels that should have killed her years ago. Instead, she thrived. Another failed harvest sector, her companion Marcus whispered, adjusting the filters on his breathing apparatus. Even through the protective gear, his voice carried the weight of despair that had consumed most survivors. The contamination has spread another 2 kilometers since last month. Maya stood, brushing the toxic soil from her bare hands. Where her skin had made contact, tiny green shoots were already beginning to emerge from the poisoned earth. She had long since stopped trying to explain the phenomenon to others. They either feared her as some kind of mutant aberration or worshipped her as humanity's savior. Neither response felt particularly accurate. The transformation had begun 3 years ago, on the day the Jung Corporation's terraforming experiment had gone catastrophically wrong. Instead of converting the planet's harsh atmosphere into something habitable, their molecular atmospheric processes had released a cascade of biological warfare agents that turned the very air into a weapon against life itself. Plants withered and died within hours. Animals fell in convulsions. The few humans who survived the initial wave found themselves trapped in underground bunkers, slowly starving as their food supplies dwindled. Maya had been different from the beginning. While others sickened and weakened, she seemed to absorb the corruption, transforming it into something else entirely. Her body had become a living laboratory where toxic compounds were broken down and reconstituted into forms that could sustain life. The first sign had been her garden in Sector 7, where somehow, impossibly, tomatoes had grown fat and red in soil that registered lethal on every scanner. The Settlement Council is meeting again tonight, Marcus continued, his eyes scanning the horizon for the creatures that had begun appearing in the wasteland. They want to discuss the Peterson incident. Maya's jaw tightened. James Peterson had been one of the council members, a former agricultural scientist who had opposed her methods from the beginning. He had called her experiments dangerous, uncontrolled, potentially catastrophic for what remained of human civilization. Last week, he had attempted to destroy her main cultivation site while she was away gathering specimens. He had succeeded in burning down 3 of her greenhouses before one of her companions had intervened. The companion in question had been Basilisk, a creature that most would classify as one of the monsters spawned by the environmental collapse. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with crystalline growths covering its serpentine body, Basilisk possessed the ability to convert toxic atmospheric compounds into breathable air. It had also possessed enough intelligence to recognize Peterson as a threat, and enough restraint to merely paralyze him rather than dissolve his bones with acid secretions. Peterson had survived, but his worldview had not. The experience of being completely helpless before one of Maya's pets had shattered his understanding of the New World Order. He had spent the following days in the medical bay speaking in whispers about the end of human dominance and the rise of something else entirely. "What does the council want to do about Peterson?" Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They want you to release the creature. Send it back into the wasteland where it came from." Marcus's voice carried no conviction. He had seen what the wasteland did to living things. Even the monsters that called it home were constantly adapting, evolving, struggling to survive in an environment that shifted its lethality daily. Maya began walking toward the settlement's outer perimeter, her footsteps leaving small patches of green in the dead earth. Basilisk isn't just a pet, Marcus. It's a partner. It processes atmospheric toxins that would kill everyone in the settlement within hours if the air recycling systems failed. It also happens to be more intelligent than half the council members. This was not an exaggeration. Maya had spent countless hours learning to communicate with the creatures that had emerged from the ecological collapse. They operated on different cognitive frameworks than humans, but they were undeniably intelligent. Basilisk could solve complex chemical problems that stumped the settlement's remaining scientists. Thornback, a massive arthropod covered in what appeared to be flowering vines, had demonstrated an intuitive understanding of agricultural genetics that exceeded anything Maya had learned in her formal education. The relationship between Maya and her companions had evolved organically. She provided them with safe territory and reliable sources of the specific nutrients they required. In return, they offered protection, specialized knowledge and abilities that complemented her own mysterious capacity to transform toxic environments into thriving ecosystems. The settlement of Haven's Rest had initially welcomed Maya's presence. Food had been scarce, and her ability to grow crops in contaminated soil had literally kept hundreds of people alive through the worst periods following the collapse. But as her methods became more unconventional and her companions more numerous and exotic, fear had begun to replace gratitude. The truth was that Maya understood why the council members were afraid. She was no longer entirely human, if she had ever been human at all. The changes in her body went far beyond simple radiation resistance. Her cellular structure had been fundamentally altered, allowing her to process toxins that should have been instantly lethal. Her nervous system had developed new pathways that enabled her to communicate with creatures whose sensory modalities operated outside the normal human spectrum. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to think in ways that prioritized the overall ecological balance over specifically human interests. The settlement's main gates came into view, constructed from salvaged materials and reinforced with the kind of desperate ingenuity that characterized post-collapse architecture. Guard towers flanked the entrance, their occupants armed with weapons that were largely ineffective against the creatures that roamed the wasteland, but which provided psychological comfort to the defenders. As Maya approached, she could see the guards tensing. Their fear was not entirely unreasonable. She was rarely alone anymore. Today, her immediate companions included Whisper, a fox-like creature whose fur contained photosynthetic organisms that glowed softly in the toxic twilight, and Groundkeeper, a massive subterranean entity that surfaced occasionally to share information about underground water sources and mineral deposits.
"Maya," called out Sarah Kim, the chief gate guard. "The council wants to see you before you enter the settlement. They're waiting in the outer meeting hall."
The outer meeting hall was a diplomatic compromise, a structure built just inside the settlement's defensive perimeter that's separate from the main living areas. It allowed the council to meet with Maya without requiring her companions to venture deeper into human territory, where their presence might cause panic among the civilian population. Maya nodded to Sarah and changed direction toward the meeting hall. Marcus fell into step beside her, while Whisper and Groundkeeper positioned themselves at what had become their customary watching posts. The arrangements had been worked out through trial and error over many months, a delicate balance between Maya's need to maintain her partnerships with the creatures and the settlement's need to feel secure. The meeting hall was a simple structure, 4 walls and a roof constructed from prefabricated panels that had been salvaged from industrial sites throughout the region. Inside, a rectangular table dominated the space, surrounded by mismatched chairs that reflected the scavenged nature of post-collapse civilization. 7 council members were present, representing the major factions within the settlement. Dr. Elizabeth Warren spoke for the medical staff, while engineer Tom Rodriguez represented the technical specialists responsible for maintaining the settlement's life support systems. Former teacher Janet Mills advocated for the children and civilian families. Captain David Chen commanded the security forces. Agricultural specialist Linda Foster managed food distribution. Communications officer Mike Thompson handled external relations with other surviving settlements. At the head of the table sat Director Helen Martinez, the de facto leader who had guided the settlement through its formation and early development. The atmosphere in the room was tense, charged with the kind of desperate energy that characterized most decision-making processes in their reduced circumstances. Every choice carried potentially catastrophic consequences, and the margin for error had effectively disappeared. "Maya," Director Martinez began, without preamble, "we need to discuss the future of your research program and the security implications of your growing collection of creatures." Maya settled into her chair, noting that none of the council members had bothered with the usual social pleasantries. This was going to be a difficult conversation. "I'm listening." Dr. Warren leaned forward, her medical training evident in her precise delivery. "The Peterson incident has raised serious questions about the safety protocols surrounding your companions. We have documented evidence that the creature you call Basilisk possesses offensive capabilities that could pose a significant threat to human life." "Basilisk prevented Peterson from destroying equipment that produces food for this settlement," Maya replied evenly. "If that's a threat to human life, then Peterson's actions were an even greater threat. Captain Chen's military background was apparent in his blunt assessment of the situation. The problem is control, Maya. You're asking us to trust creatures that we don't understand, can't communicate with, and can't predict. That's an unacceptable security risk."
Maya felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest. The council members were intelligent people, but they remained trapped in pre-collapse thinking patterns that prevented them from adapting to their new reality. You can't communicate with them because you haven't tried to learn their communication methods. You can't predict them because you refuse to study their behavioral patterns. And you don't understand them because you've decided they're monsters, rather than recognizing them as fellow survivors of the same ecological disaster that nearly wiped us out. Engineer Rodriguez adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit that had become more pronounced as the settlement's technical challenges mounted. Maya. Even if we accept that these creatures are intelligent, there's still the question of compatibility. Human society operates according to certain principles and structures. We can't simply integrate beings whose motivations and goals may be fundamentally different from our own. What principles and structures? Maya asked pointedly. The same principles that led to the terraforming disaster? The same structures that created the conditions for ecological collapse? Maybe it's time to consider that human society's traditional approaches aren't working. The silence that followed her words was heavy with implication. Maya had touched on the fundamental question that haunted every survivor: whether humanity's traditional ways of organizing society were adequate for their current circumstances, or whether survival required more radical adaptations. Agricultural specialist Foster spoke up, her voice carefully measured. Maya, your cultivation methods have been extremely valuable to this settlement. No one is disputing that. But we're concerned about the long-term implications of depending on processes that we don't fully understand. What happens if something goes wrong? What happens if you're not available to manage these relationships? It was a fair question, and Maya had spent considerable time thinking about it. The reality was that her abilities were still evolving, and she didn't fully understand them herself. More concerning was the fact that she seemed to be the only human who had developed this particular set of adaptations. If something happened to her, the settlement would lose not only her agricultural contributions, but also her ability to communicate with the creatures that were becoming increasingly important to their survival. I'm working on developing training protocols, Maya said. Marcus has been learning basic communication techniques, and I've been documenting the behavioral patterns and care requirements for each species. The goal is to create systems that can function even if I'm not available. Communications Officer Thompson had been listening to the discussion with the analytical detachment that characterized his approach to most settlement issues. Maya, we've received reports from other settlements about similar creatures appearing in their regions. Some of these reports describe attacks on human populations. How do we know that your companions won't eventually turn hostile? Maya had been expecting this question. The reports Thompson referenced were real, and some of them did describe violent encounters between humans and post-collapse creatures. However, the reports consistently failed to provide context about the circumstances that led to these confrontations. In every case Maya had investigated, the violence had been initiated by humans who treated the creatures as mindless predators rather than attempting communication or coexistence. The creatures that have formed partnerships with me have done so voluntarily, Maya explained. They could leave at any time, and they could certainly harm me if they chose to do so. The fact that they remain and continue to cooperate suggests that they see mutual benefit in our relationship. The attacks you're referencing typically occur when humans attempt to drive the creatures away from resources they need for survival. Teacher Mills spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the patient tone she had developed through years of working with children. Maya, I understand the logic of your approach, but we also have to consider the psychological impact on our community. The children are having nightmares about monsters. Some of the adults are requesting transfers to other settlements. People are afraid. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect of Maya's situation. She could provide rational explanations for her methods and demonstrate the practical benefits of cooperation with the post-collapse creatures, but she could not easily address the deep-seated fears that drove human reactions to beings that looked and behaved in ways that violated traditional expectations. Its fear is understandable, Maya acknowledged. These creatures do look different from anything humans have encountered before. But fear based on appearance, rather than behavior, is exactly the kind of thinking that creates unnecessary conflict. We need to help people understand that different doesn't automatically mean dangerous. Director Martinez had been quietly observing the discussion, waiting for the right moment to present what Maya suspected was the real purpose of this meeting. Maya, the Council has been in contact with representatives from the Northern Alliance settlements. They've offered to provide technical support for expanding our agricultural programs using conventional methods. They're also offering to share their latest research on atmospheric decontamination.
The Northern Alliance was a consortium of settlements that had maintained more traditional approaches to post-collapse survival. They relied heavily on sealed environments, advanced filtration systems, and carefully controlled agricultural programs that avoided contact with contaminated soil and atmosphere.
Their methods were demonstrably effective for maintaining stable human populations, but they also required substantial technological resources and energy inputs that were increasingly difficult to obtain. Maya understood the implication immediately. The Council was being offered an alternative to her methods, one that felt safer and more familiar even if it was potentially less sustainable in the long term. What would partnership with the Northern Alliance require? Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew. Captain Chen answered with military directness. They want assurance that we're not harboring potentially dangerous creatures that could spread to their territories. They're particularly concerned about biological contamination and the possibility that these creatures might be carrying pathogens that could affect their populations. Maya felt something cold settling in her stomach. The Northern Alliance's concerns were not entirely unreasonable from their perspective, but their solutions typically involved eliminating perceived threats rather than finding ways to coexist with them. They want me to get rid of my companions, Maya said. They want us to implement standard containment protocols, Director Martinez corrected, though her tone suggested that she understood the practical implications were the same. The room fell silent as everyone waited for Maya's response. She could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the weighing of known risks against unknown benefits, the appeal of solutions that felt familiar even when they might not be optimal. Maya stood up slowly, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The choice the Council was presenting was not really about agricultural methods or creature management. It was about what kind of future they wanted to build from the ruins of the old world. I need time to consider this, Maya said finally. This conversation involves more than just my personal situation. We're talking about fundamental questions of how humans should relate to the environment that emerged from the collapse. Warren nodded professionally. How much time do you need? Maya looked around the table, studying the faces of people who had become her colleagues, her community, and now potentially her opponents. Give me 3 days. I'll have an answer for you then. As Maya left the meeting hall, she could feel the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. The Council was offering her a choice between safety and growth, between the familiar and the unknown, between the old ways of thinking and the new realities that were still emerging from the ecological disaster. Outside, Whisper and Groundkeeper were waiting for her, their alien forms silhouetted against the toxic sunset that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been created by atmospheric contamination. Maya reached out to touch Whisper's photosynthetic fur, feeling the gentle warmth generated by the symbiotic organisms that converted deadly radiation into usable energy. These creatures had not asked to be brought into existence by humanity's failed terraforming experiment, but they had adapted to the world they had been given. They had found ways to thrive in conditions that would kill most Earth-originated life forms. The question now was whether humans could learn to adapt with similar creativity and flexibility, or whether they would remain trapped in the thinking patterns that had led to the collapse in the first place. Maya began the long walk back to her laboratory complex, her mind already working through the implications of the Council's ultimatum. She had 3 days to find a solution that could satisfy the settlement's need for security, while preserving the partnerships that had become central to her work and, increasingly, to her identity. Behind her, Marcus followed in thoughtful silence, understanding that his friend was facing a decision that would determine not just her own future, but the future of human-creature coexistence in their transformed world. Part 2. The choice between Worlds Maya's laboratory complex sprawled across what had once been the settlement's industrial district, a collection of interconnected structures that reflected her evolving understanding of post-collapse biotechnology. Unlike the sterile, controlled environments favored by traditional scientific institutions, her facilities were designed to accommodate the complex relationships between different species and environmental systems. The main greenhouse dominated the center of the complex, its transparent walls revealing the impossible sight of lush vegetation growing in soil that should have been lifeless. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, their red flesh free from the contamination that characterized most food sources in the region. Grain stalks swayed gently in the artificially circulated air, their seeds containing protein levels that exceeded anything achieved by pre-collapse agricultural science. But the most remarkable aspect of the greenhouse was not the plants themselves, but the ecosystem that supported them. Crystalline formations jutted from the ground at regular intervals, their surfaces flickering with bioluminescent patterns that indicated active atmospheric processing. These were basilisk's contributions to the environment, structures that converted toxic compounds into nutrients that the plants could absorb and transform into food safe for human consumption. Near the eastern wall, a series of elevated platforms supported what appeared to be flowering trees, their branches heavy with fruit that glowed with a soft internal light. These were Thornback's modifications to standard Earth genetics, plants that had been altered to incorporate light-producing organs that could photosynthesize using the radiation-heavy spectrum that characterized their planet's current atmosphere. Throughout the greenhouse, smaller creatures moved with purposeful efficiency. Some resembled insects, but with metallic exoskeletons that protected them from environmental toxins while allowing them to pollinate the modified plants. Others looked like miniature lizards, but with specialized digestive systems that allowed them to process organic waste and convert it into fertilizer compounds that enhanced soil productivity. Maya moved through this ecosystem with the comfort of someone who understood her place within its complex relationships. She was not the dominant entity controlling every aspect of the environment, but rather a participant who contributed her own unique capabilities while benefiting from the specialized abilities of her partners. At the far end of the greenhouse, a section had been devoted to experimental cultivation techniques that pushed the boundaries of what most people would consider agriculture. Here, plants grew in symbiotic relationship with fungal networks that extended deep into the contaminated soil, creating communication pathways that allowed different species to share resources and information across vast distances. Maya knelt beside one of these experimental plots, pressing her palm against the soil and feeling the subtle vibrations that indicated healthy fungal activity. Through her modified nervous system, she could sense the chemical signatures that the plants were using to communicate with each other, a language of molecular exchanges that conveyed information about resource availability, environmental threats, and genetic modifications. "The northern quadrant is reporting optimal nutrient levels," she murmured to herself, translating the chemical signals into human terms. "The southeastern section needs additional phosphorus supplementation." Behind her, Marcus was documenting the day's observations using equipment that Maya had modified to interface with the biological monitoring systems that her companions maintained. The data they collected was unlike anything that traditional agricultural science had ever produced, combining conventional measurements of soil chemistry and plant health with readings from biological sensors that could detect molecular-level changes in the ecosystem. "Maya," Marcus said, looking up from his instruments, "the soil pH readings in Section 7 are showing some interesting fluctuations. It looks like the fungal network is actively adjusting chemical conditions in response to changes in plant metabolism." Maya nodded, unsurprised. The living systems in her greenhouse had developed feedback mechanisms that allowed them to self-regulate in ways that exceeded the sophistication of most technological monitoring systems. The plants, fungi, and bacterial colonies were essentially functioning as a distributed intelligence that could identify and respond to problems faster than any human administrator. "The traditional approach to agriculture treats soil as an inert medium that we manipulate to support plant growth," Maya said, moving to examine the readings Marcus had collected. "But soil is actually a living ecosystem. When we work with that ecosystem instead of trying to control it, we get results that are impossible to achieve through conventional methods." This was the fundamental difference between Maya's approach and the methods favored by settlements like those in the Northern Alliance. Traditional post-collapse agriculture focused on creating isolated, controlled environments where human technology could maintain the conditions necessary for Earth-originated plants to survive. Maya's methods integrated human intelligence with the adaptive capabilities of post-collapse life forms to create hybrid ecosystems that could thrive in the transformed environment. The results spoke for themselves. Maya's complex produced more food per square meter than any other agricultural facility in the region, while using a fraction of the energy and technological resources required by conventional methods. More importantly, her systems were becoming more productive over time as the relationships between different species became more sophisticated and efficient. But these advantages came with costs that made many people uncomfortable. Maya's methods required accepting that humans were no longer the dominant species on their planet, and that survival might require partnerships with beings whose motivations and capabilities were fundamentally different from traditional human allies. A soft chiming sound drew Maya's attention to the communication array that she had developed for interacting with her companions. The array consisted of a combination of electronic sensors, chemical detectors, and biological interfaces that allowed her to translate between human communication methods and the various sensory modalities used by different post-collapse species. The signal was coming from Groundkeeper, who was currently maintaining its position near the settlement's outer perimeter. Through the communication array, Maya could perceive the creature's report as a complex pattern of vibrations, chemical signatures, and electromagnetic fluctuations that conveyed information about underground water sources, mineral deposits, and potential threats to the settlement's security. Today's report included an alert that made Maya's blood run cold. Groundkeeper had detected the approach of a Northern Alliance reconnaissance team, moving toward the settlement using stealth technology that was designed to avoid detection by conventional sensors. The team consisted of approximately 12 individuals, equipped with advanced weapons and what appeared to be biological containment equipment. Maya closed her eyes and reached out through the communication network that connected her to all of her companions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A flood of sensory data from creatures positioned throughout the region, each contributing their own specialized perspective on the approaching threat. Basilisk confirmed the presence of atmospheric disturbances consistent with aircraft using cloaking technology. Thornback detected chemical signatures indicating the presence of sterilization compounds typically used for biological warfare. Whisper's enhanced electromagnetic sensitivity revealed communication signals that suggested the approaching team was coordinating with allies already within the settlement. The pattern was unmistakable. The Northern Alliance was not simply offering an alternative approach to agriculture and survival. They were preparing to enforce their standards on settlements that refused to comply with their containment protocols. Maya opened her eyes and found Marcus watching her with growing concern. Her expression must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation because he immediately began securing the laboratory's sensitive equipment without waiting for explanation. "How much time do we have?" Marcus asked. Maya consulted the communication array, cross-referencing reports from multiple sources to triangulate the reconnaissance team's position and estimated arrival time. 6 hours, maybe less if they're using advanced transportation methods. This put Maya in an impossible position. The Settlements Council was expecting her to provide an answer to their ultimatum within 3 days, but the Northern Alliance had apparently decided not to wait for the results of that negotiation. They were moving to implement their preferred solution regardless of what the local population might choose. Maya's mind raced through options and possibilities. She could warn the settlement's security forces about the approaching threat, but Captain Chen would immediately assume that Maya's companions were somehow responsible for attracting unwanted attention. She could attempt to negotiate directly with the Northern Alliance team, but their presence suggested that they had already moved beyond diplomatic solutions. The third option was the one that Maya had been hoping to avoid. She could implement the evacuation protocols that she had developed in case her work became incompatible with the settlement's survival needs. This would mean abandoning the complex that had become her life's work, but it would also protect her companions from whatever the Northern Alliance had planned. "Marcus," Maya said, her voice carefully controlled, "I need you to return to the settlement and find Dr. Warren. Tell her that we've detected an incoming biological threat and that the medical facilities should begin preparation for potential contamination. Don't mention the specifics of what we've discovered." Marcus paused in his equipment securing activities, clearly sensing that Maya was not telling him everything. What kind of biological threat? Maya met his eyes, knowing that this might be the last time she could speak to him honestly about her situation. The kind that requires people to choose between safety and freedom, between familiar solutions and adaptive ones. Understanding dawned on Marcus's face. He had worked with Maya long enough to recognize the political implications of her phrasing. "They're coming to shut down the complex." Maya nodded. "The Northern Alliance has apparently decided that our methods pose an unacceptable risk to their containment strategies. They're not interested in negotiating or finding compromise solutions." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of this development. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of determination that Maya had not expected. "What can I do to help?" It was a simple question, but it forced Maya to confront the reality of her situation. For 3 years, she had been trying to balance her loyalty to the human settlement with her commitment to the post-collapse ecosystem that had become her home. Now she was being forced to choose between them. "I need you to help evacuate any personnel who want to leave before the Northern Alliance arrives. Maya said. Anyone who stays will be considered complicit in whatever they decide my crimes are. And what about you? Maya looked around the greenhouse, taking in the impossible beauty of the ecosystem that she and her companions had created together. Plants that should not exist were thriving in soil that should not support life, tended by creatures that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between species and the limits of biological adaptation. I'm going to do what any organism does when its environment becomes hostile, Maya said. I'm going to adapt. Over the next 4 hours, Maya and Marcus worked with desperate efficiency to implement contingency plans that Maya had hoped never to use. Critical equipment was secured or destroyed to prevent it from being captured and potentially misused. Biological samples were distributed among her companions, who would carry the genetic information to locations where it could be safely preserved. Communication arrays were reprogrammed to self-destruct after transmitting final status reports. Most importantly, Maya activated the protocols that would allow her companions to disperse throughout the region, maintaining their network while avoiding concentration in any single location that could be targeted by the Northern Alliance. The evacuation of human personnel proved more complicated than Maya had anticipated. Word of the approaching threat had spread quickly through the settlement, but reactions varied dramatically. Some people, particularly those who had worked directly with Maya's programs, chose to leave immediately for destinations that would take them away from the conflict. Others, including several council members, demanded explanations that Maya could not provide without compromising her companion's security. Dr. Warren arrived at the complex as the sun was setting, her medical training evident in her systematic approach to assessing the situation. Maya, the council needs to know exactly what kind of threat we're facing. If there's a biological hazard, we need to implement appropriate containment procedures. Maya had been dreading this conversation. Warren was a competent, ethical person who had consistently supported Maya's work even when she disagreed with specific methods. The approaching crisis was going to force Maya to betray that trust in ways that might never be repairable. The threat is not biological contamination in the traditional sense, Maya said carefully. It's a conflict between different approaches to post-collapse survival. The Northern Alliance has apparently decided that our methods are incompatible with their security requirements. Dr. Warren's expression shifted from medical concern to political understanding. They're coming to shut down your research program. They're coming to implement what they call containment protocols, Maya confirmed. Based on their equipment loadout, those protocols appear to include sterilization of any biological material that doesn't conform to their standards. Dr. Warren was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. Maya, if they're planning to use sterilization compounds, we need to evacuate the entire settlement. Those chemicals don't discriminate between target organisms and innocent bystanders. Maya nodded grimly. This was exactly the scenario she had been trying to avoid. The Northern Alliance's intervention was not just threatening her work and her companions, it was endangering the entire human population of the settlement. I've been working on evacuation procedures, Maya said. The question is whether the Council will authorize a general evacuation based on my assessment of the threat. Dr. Warren's response surprised Maya. The Council authorized me to implement emergency medical protocols if I determined that the situation warranted immediate action. As Chief Medical Officer, I'm declaring a biological hazard emergency and ordering immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel. It was a bold decision that could end Dr. Warren's career if the threat proved less serious than anticipated. But it was also the kind of leadership that had kept the settlement alive through 3 years of post-collapse challenges. What about essential personnel? Maya asked. Warren's expression was grim but determined. Security forces will remain to coordinate the evacuation and provide protection for people who can't leave immediately. Medical staff will maintain basic services until everyone is clear. Beyond that, people will have to make their own choices about what they're willing to risk. As word of the evacuation order spread through the settlement, Maya found herself facing a decision that she had been avoiding since the council meeting. She could leave with the evacuees, abandoning her complex and her companions to whatever fate the Northern Alliance had planned. Or she could remain, accepting the personal consequences while trying to protect the ecosystem that had become her life's work. The choice would have been easier if it only affected her own future. But Maya's companions were not just laboratory subjects or exotic pets. They were intelligent beings who had formed voluntary partnerships based on mutual benefit and shared goals. Abandoning them to face the Northern Alliance alone would be a betrayal of everything she had learned about cooperation and adaptation in the post-collapse world. As the evacuation proceeded around her, Maya made her decision. She would remain at the complex, not as a human scientist studying alien creatures, but as a participant in a multi-species community that had found ways to thrive in an environment that had defeated traditional human approaches to survival. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Maya had read that phrase countless times in the philosophical text that had sustained her through the darkest periods following the collapse. Now she understood its meaning in ways that went beyond human psychology and individual development. Her weak self was the part of her that still thought in terms of human versus nature, civilization versus wilderness, control versus adaptation. That self had to be destroyed not through violence or self-denial, but through expansion into something larger and more complex than traditional human identity. By the time the Northern Alliance reconnaissance team reached the settlement's outer perimeter, Maya was no longer trying to defend a human research facility against external threats. She was protecting a multi-species community from forces that threatened its right to exist. The transformation was complete, but the real test was just beginning. Part 3. Evolution Beyond Destruction. The Northern Alliance forces arrived under cover of darkness, their advanced stealth technology rendering them nearly invisible to conventional senses. Maya watched their approach through the sensory network maintained by her companions, perceiving the intruders as overlapping patterns of heat signatures, electromagnetic disturbances, and chemical traces that painted a comprehensive picture of their capabilities and intentions. 12 operatives, as Groundkeeper had initially reported, but their equipment loadout was more sophisticated than Maya had anticipated. They carried weapons designed specifically for biological warfare, sterilization compounds that could break down organic molecules at the cellular level, and containment devices that appeared designed for capturing specimens rather than simply destroying them. Maya felt a chill of recognition. The Northern Alliance was not simply implementing security protocols. They were conducting a harvesting operation, planning to capture examples of post-collapse life forms for study and potential exploitation. Through the communication array, Maya sensed her companions' responses to the approaching threat. Basilisk's crystalline structures began modulating their atmospheric processing activities, creating chemical conditions that would be toxic to unprotected humans while remaining harmless to adapted life forms. Whisper and the smaller creatures began dispersing throughout the complex, preparing for coordinated defensive actions that would protect critical facilities while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. But the most significant response came from Groundkeeper, whose vast underground network suddenly revealed capabilities that Maya had never suspected. Through seismic vibrations that her modified nervous system could perceive as clearly as spoken language, the creature reported that it was not alone. Other groundkeepers were positioned throughout the region, connected by subterranean passages that formed a communication network spanning hundreds of kilometers. Maya realized that she had been thinking too small. Her complex was not an isolated experiment in human-creature cooperation. It was one node in a vast ecosystem of post-collapse life forms that had been quietly adapting and organizing themselves, while human settlements struggled to maintain their traditional approaches to survival. The implications were staggering. While humans had been focused on containment and control, the post-collapse creatures had been building a civilization based on cooperation and mutual support. Maya had stumbled into partnership with members of that civilization, but she was far from being its creator or leader. A vibration through the communication array indicated that the Northern Alliance team was beginning their final approach to the complex. Maya had perhaps 15 minutes before they reached the outer facilities, and her response during that time would determine not just her own fate, but the future of human-creature relations in the region. Maya activated the complex's final contingency protocol, a communication system that would broadcast her message across the entire post-collapse creature network. The message was simple but comprehensive, combining human language with the chemical, electromagnetic, and vibrational communication methods used by different species. I am Maya Chen, human partner in the multi-species community centered at coordinates. Armed forces from the Northern Alliance are approaching with intent to destroy our community and capture members for study and exploitation. I am requesting assistance in defense of our shared ecosystem. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the region, creatures that Maya had never encountered began reporting their positions and capabilities. The post-collapse ecosystem was far more extensive and organized than anyone had realized, with communication networks that spanned continents and resource-sharing agreements that made human trade relationships look primitive by comparison. But more importantly, the response revealed that Maya's work had been observed and evaluated by intelligences that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. Her complex had been successful not because she had tamed or controlled post-collapse creatures, but because she had demonstrated that humans could potentially participate in the new form of civilization that was emerging from the ecological disaster. A new set of vibrations indicated that the Northern Alliance team had reached the complex's outer perimeter. Through Whisper's electromagnetic sensitivity, Maya could perceive their communication signals as they coordinated their assault on what they assumed was an isolated research facility defended by a single human scientist and her collection of mutant pets. They were about to discover that their assumptions were catastrophically wrong. The first indication that something was not proceeding according to the Northern Alliance's plan came when their sterilization compounds failed to affect the atmospheric processing systems that Basilisk had established throughout the complex. Instead of breaking down the crystalline structures, the chemicals were absorbed and converted into nutrients that enhanced the growth rate of nearby plant life. The second indication came when their attempts to cut through the complex's outer barriers triggered defensive responses from systems that did not appear on any of their reconnaissance reports. Thornback's elevated platforms began releasing airborne compounds that interfered with the functionality of electronic equipment, while underground networks activated electromagnetic fields that disrupted communication signals. But the truly shocking development occurred when the assault team attempted to breach the main greenhouse facility. Instead of facing a single human defender and a handful of exotic creatures, they found themselves confronting a coordinated response from entities that demonstrated tactical intelligence and strategic planning capabilities that exceeded military standards. Maya watched the confrontation unfold through multiple sensory channels, perceiving the battle as a complex dance of chemical exchanges, electromagnetic manipulations, and biological adaptations that occurred too quickly and across too many dimensions for conventional human senses to follow. The Northern Alliance operatives were skilled and well-equipped, but they were fighting an enemy that operated according to principles they did not understand. Their weapons were designed to kill individual targets or destroy specific facilities. They were not prepared to confront a distributed intelligence that could adapt its defensive strategies in real time while maintaining perfect coordination across multiple locations. Within 30 minutes, the assault had ended. The Northern Alliance forces had not been killed or permanently injured, but they had been systematically neutralized by techniques that left them psychologically shattered and strategically defeated. Their weapons had been dissolved by acid secretions that somehow left their protective gear intact. Their communication equipment had been disabled by electromagnetic pulses that were precisely calibrated to affect military frequencies while leaving civilian electronics functional. Most disturbing of all, their sterilization compounds had been converted into healing agents that repaired environmental damage they had inflicted during their approach. Maya emerged from the greenhouse complex to find the Northern Alliance team members sitting in a circle, their weapons and equipment neatly stacked nearby, their expressions showing the kind of profound disorientation that came from having one's fundamental assumptions about reality systematically demolished. "You're going to be released unharmed," Maya told them, her voice carrying across the distance through Basilisk's atmospheric manipulation capabilities. "Your equipment will be returned to you in working condition. You will be provided with medical attention for any injuries you sustain during the engagement." The team leader, a middle-aged woman whose military bearing remained intact despite her obvious psychological distress, looked up at Maya with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What are you people?" It was a fair question, and one that Maya had been grappling with herself. The events of the past few hours had revealed that she was no longer operating as an individual human scientist studying post-collapse creatures. She had become something else entirely, a bridge between human and post-collapse civilizations, a translator between different forms of intelligence, a participant in forms of cooperation that transcended traditional species boundaries. "We're the next step," Maya said simply. "We're what happens when humans learn to adapt instead of trying to control." Over the following hours, as the Northern Alliance team was provided with medical attention and prepared for departure, Maya found herself engaged in a series of conversations that challenged her ability to explain concepts that existed outside the boundaries of traditional human language. The team's xenobiologist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had spent her career studying post-collapse life forms from the perspective of containment and control. Her questions reflected a worldview that treated the creatures as dangerous but potentially useful resources that needed to be managed through superior human technology and intelligence. "How do you maintain dominance over creatures that possess such advanced capabilities?" Dr. Martinez asked, gesturing toward Thornback's elevated platforms where fruit continued to ripen despite the recent violence. Maya found herself struggling to explain that the question was based on false premises. There is no dominance relationship. These are partnerships based on mutual benefit and shared goals. But you're human, Dr. Martinez insisted. These creatures are products of genetic damage and environmental corruption. How can you form meaningful partnerships with beings that don't share your evolutionary background or cultural development? Maya looked around the complex, taking in the evidence of cooperation and coordination that had emerged from 3 years of patient experimentation and relationship building. Dr. Martinez, human civilization created the conditions that led to ecological collapse. Our evolutionary background and cultural development produced a disaster that nearly eliminated complex life on this planet. Maybe it's time to consider that our traditional approaches have limitations. It was a conversation that continued throughout the night, as Maya attempted to help the Northern Alliance team understand the fundamental differences between their approaches to post-collapse survival and the methods that had emerged from her community. The most difficult concept for the visitors to grasp was that Maya's companions were not subordinated to human authority. They were autonomous entities that had chosen to participate in cooperative relationships because those relationships provided benefits that they could not obtain through independent action. But how do you ensure their loyalty? Captain James Wilson asked. His military training had focused on command structures and disciplinary systems that enforced obedience through rewards and punishments. Maya gestured toward Whisper, who was currently resting near the communication array, its photosynthetic fur glowing softly in the pre-dawn light. Whisper participates in our community because we provide it with safe territory, reliable access to the radiation sources it needs for energy, and social interaction with beings who understand its communication methods. It provides us with electromagnetic sensing capabilities, atmospheric monitoring, and assistance with equipment maintenance. The relationship continues because both sides benefit from it. What happens if its needs change? Captain Wilson pressed. What happens if it decides that cooperation is no longer beneficial? Maya shrugged. Then it leaves and we adapt our community to function without its contributions. The same thing that would happen if any human member decided to relocate to a different settlement. This was perhaps the most radical aspect of Maya's approach. The recognition that sustainable communities required voluntary participation from all members, regardless of their species or cognitive structure. Coercion might produce short-term compliance, but it inevitably led to conflict and instability, as subordinated entities sought opportunities to escape or rebel against imposed authority. As dawn approached, the Northern Alliance team prepared for departure. Their mission had been a complete failure from their perspective, but Maya hoped that their experience might contribute to broader understanding of the possibilities that were emerging from human-creature cooperation. What should we report to our leadership? The team leader asked as her personnel finished their preparations. Maya considered the question carefully. The Northern Alliance leadership needed to understand that their containment strategies were not just ineffective, but actively dangerous to regional stability. Their attempts to eliminate post-collapse creatures were threatening relationships that were becoming essential for human survival in the transformed environment. Tell them that the post-collapse ecosystem is more extensive and organized than anyone has realized, Maya said. Tell them that these creatures are not mindless mutants, but intelligent beings with their own goals and capabilities. Most importantly, tell them that cooperation produces better results than confrontation. Dr. Martinez spoke up one final time before departure. Maya, even if everything you're saying is true, how do we know that these creatures will remain peaceful? How do we know they won't eventually decide that humans are unnecessary or threatening? Maya smiled, recognizing the fear behind the question, but understanding that it was based on projection of human behavioral patterns onto beings that operated according to different principles. Dr. Martinez, these creatures have already demonstrated that they could eliminate human populations if they chose to do so. The fact that they're offering partnership instead suggests that they see value in diversity and cooperation, rather than dominance and control. As the Northern Alliance team departed, Maya reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past few days. The crisis had forced her to choose between her human identity and her commitment to the post-collapse ecosystem, but the choice had revealed that this was a false dichotomy. She had not stopped being human. Instead, she had expanded her understanding of what humanity could become when it embraced adaptation, rather than control, cooperation rather than dominance, diversity rather than uniformity.
The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Maya now understood that her weak self had been the part of her that accepted artificial limitations on human potential, that assumed cooperation required similarity, that believed survival required the subordination of other forms of intelligence to human authority. Destroying that weak self had not diminished her humanity. It had revealed possibilities for human development that transcended traditional biological and cultural boundaries. As the sun rose over the complex, Maya began planning the next phase of her work. The Northern Alliance would likely return with larger forces and more sophisticated strategies. Other human settlements would need to decide whether they wanted to pursue partnership with post-collapse creatures or continue trying to maintain isolation through technological control. But Maya was no longer facing these challenges alone. She was part of a community that spanned multiple species and operated according to principles that had proven more effective than traditional human approaches to survival and development. The crops continued to thrive in soil that should have been lifeless. The monsters had indeed become her partners, contributing capabilities that complemented human intelligence while pursuing their own goals and interests. And Maya herself had become something new, a human being who had learned to adapt rather than control, to cooperate rather than dominate, to embrace diversity rather than enforce uniformity. The weak self that had believed humans must remain separate from and superior to their environment had been destroyed. What remained was a new form of human identity that could participate in the complex cooperative civilization that was emerging from the ashes of ecological collapse. Maya walked through her greenhouse, surrounded by the impossible beauty of life forms that thrived where science said they could not exist, tended by creatures that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between species and the limits of biological cooperation. She was no longer trying to save humanity from the post-collapse world. She was helping humanity evolve into something capable of participating in that world's emerging civilization. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The future belonged to those who could learn to adapt, to cooperate, to transcend the limitations that had led to collapse in the first place. Maya smiled as she felt the familiar pulse of the communication network that connected her to companions across the continent. She was home, finally and completely, in a world that was larger and more wonderful than anything human civilization had ever imagined possible. The unlivable planet had become livable through cooperation. The unstoppable girl had become part of something even more unstoppable, a new form of civilization based on diversity, adaptation, and mutual support rather than control, dominance, and exploitation. And the man who had destroyed his weak self could never be destroyed by others because he had become part of something larger than individual identity, something stronger than any force that sought to impose limitation through fear and control. Maya's story was no longer just her own. It had become part of the larger story of how life finds ways to thrive even in the most challenging circumstances, how intelligence emerges from cooperation between different forms of consciousness, and how transformation is always possible for those willing to embrace adaptation rather than cling to familiar patterns that no longer serve their purpose. The planet was still recovering from ecological collapse, but it was no longer dying. New forms of life were emerging that could thrive in the transformed environment, and new forms of civilization were developing that incorporated the lessons learned from humanity's failures as well as its successes. Maya had become a bridge between the old world and the new one, a translator between human intelligence and post-collapse consciousness, a living example of what becomes possible when beings learn to destroy their limiting assumptions about what they can become. The story was ending, but it was also beginning. Every ending contained the seeds of new possibilities. Every destruction cleared the way for new forms of creation. Every death gave birth to new forms of life. Maya's garden continued to grow, tended by hands both human and non-human, sustained by cooperation that transcended species boundaries, nourished by the understanding that survival required not the domination of nature, but participation in its endless creative processes. She had learned to thrive on an unlivable planet by becoming unstoppable herself, and by recognizing that the only way to become truly unstoppable was to become part of something larger than individual will or species identity. The weak self that had believed in limitation and separation had been destroyed. What remained was connected to everything, limited by nothing, capable of adapting to any challenge that the universe might present. Maya walked among her companions, human and non-human alike, surrounded by abundance that had emerged from apparent disaster, supported by relationships that had grown from apparent impossibility,
sustained by hope that had survived apparent defeat. The future stretched out before them, vast and uncertain and full of potential that could only be realized through continued cooperation, continued adaptation, continued willingness to destroy limiting assumptions about what life could become. Maya smiled as she felt the sun warming her face, breathing air that had been cleaned by her companions, standing on soil that had been healed through their cooperation, surrounded by evidence that the impossible was merely the not yet attempted. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has become part of the eternal process of creation itself, part of the endless dance of adaptation and cooperation that transforms apparent endings into new beginnings, apparent defeats into unexpected victories, apparent limitations into unlimited possibilities. Maya's story continued, as did the larger story of which it was part, the endless story of life finding ways to thrive, intelligence finding ways to emerge, cooperation finding ways to transcend competition, love finding ways to overcome fear. The garden grew, the partnerships flourished, the future remained full of promise for those brave enough to destroy their limiting beliefs about what they could become. Maya had learned the secret of becoming unstoppable. It required becoming part of something larger than oneself, something stronger than any external force, something more enduring than any individual existence. She had become part of life itself, and life, as she had learned, was truly unstoppable.